Well, we're in a second part of our series, The Way of Jesus. We have been in Luke now since the beginning of December, and we're going to be in it all the way through Easter. And I've just enjoyed, it's been a little while since we got to settle down this many weeks into one book, and I've just enjoyed that process. This is kind of part two of of Luke as a whole, and we're really looking at the teachings of Jesus and the way that Jesus lived his life. Have you ever been in a crowd of people? You know the scene, right? When you're in a crowd of people kind of inching forward at one step at a time. Someone taller usually steps in front of you. You've been in that concert or that group environment where somebody you're like trying to see and somebody taller than you steps in front of you. You're like, oh, right? Or you're moving and you're like, you've ever been in a crowd of people where you have to kind of bring your arms in tight because you're shoulder to shoulder with people, and if you have claustrophobia, that's your worst nightmare, right? So tight though, but like, have you ever noticed in that kind of setting, little kids, they can figure it out, right? They just dart between the legs and go all over the place, and crowds have their own kind of scene, don't they? Their own kind of environment when you're in a crowd of people. Everyone trying to find their spot. Maybe you've been like, not so much anymore because the advent of online shopping, but like you remember back like in the day a little bit when Black Friday shopping used to be that way, where it was like everybody piled in there and like trying to get to the TVs for obnoxiously low prices, and you know what I mean? Like it used to be like this crowded environment. Maybe it was a sporting event you've been to, and that sporting event it was crowds of people, and you're waiting to get in the line and get through the line. Maybe it's a concert. You ever been in those outdoor concerts where there's just general admission, and everybody, like the doors open and everybody's trying to get to like the front by the stage, and man, that's a stressful situation, isn't it? Because people are around, you can't see, you're trying to move, and by and large, like, humans become kind of savages in a group setting, right? Have you ever noticed that? Like, where you're like, generally, like, everyday life, you're just kind of easygoing, but then you get in a group setting, especially if you want to get to the front of something, there's pushing and there's shoving and there's people edging you out and there's people stepping in front of you. There's all sorts of things that go on in a crowd. And that's what was going on this day in Jericho, in Jesus' day. In Luke chapter 19, if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Luke chapter 19. We're going to spend all morning in the first 10 verses there. But this is the scene. At this point in Luke's gospel, Jesus at the height of his popularity, the word had spread about him, the fact that he had done miracles and his teachings, and he had traveled around, and everyone wanted to get a glimpse of Jesus. Everyone wanted to be around him. And I imagine in this crowd in Jericho that day, there were probably religious elite people, right? The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Sadducees, those religious people, those people who dedicated their entire lives to following God. They were in the crowd that day. They wanted to see Jesus. They wanted an appointment with Jesus. In fact, they thought that because of their status, that they should have first priority. They should be the VIPs in the crowd setting. I imagine in the crowd that day there was honest, hardworking, blue-collar Jewish families, dads and moms with kids who had heard of this Jesus, and they wanted to see him. And so they were part of the crowd that day. I imagine there were up-and-coming young men who were aspiring to be rabbis, Jesus inspired them, and so they wanted to get a glimpse of Jesus. If you put yourself in the scene, I imagine if you've ever been to a parade, it was kind of like that. The streets were full of people, crowded to see and get a glimpse of Jesus, and I'm sure his disciples walking with him. All crowded in, pressing close, wanting to see Jesus. And here's what's interesting, though. Of all those people, we don't know any of their names. History doesn't record, the Bible doesn't record any of those names in the crowd that day. Luke doesn't tell us their name, but we do know the name of one person that day. And it was the least likely name to know. It was the least likely person in the crowd, the one that no one else remembered. His name was Zacchaeus. And even more surprising in this whole thing is that Jesus, before he even entered the town, he knew Zacchaeus' name. Let's read this story. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. I'm not going to put the whole thing on the screen. We're just going to read it from the Bible today. He entered Jericho and was passing through, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they grumbled, he has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. How many of you guys remember this story from Sunday school? Yeah? If you grew up in church, this was a popular Sunday school story that you would have learned. And I don't know about you, but growing up in church, I learned these stories, but I learned the Sunday school versions of them. And, going back, at least when I was growing up, we had these things called flannel graphs, and you'd put the stuff up on the board and tell the story through flannel. And it was always kids' version, kid appropriate, which is probably good, but sometimes the danger is if we only let these stories be Sunday school stories, we miss the depth of what Jesus wants for us. But I did promise Beth, because I was telling her I was preaching Zacchaeus and preaching for the very first time that I think I've ever preached, to take some of you back, if you grew up in church, to a little jingle that went, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And some of you remember that, obviously. But that was the Sunday school, that Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. But again, today, I want to bring us out of the Sunday school version of this story to look at what was really happening, because I think it reveals to us the way of Jesus, something special about the way of Jesus that reveals the heartbeat of what God has and would have us live. Because as we've been looking at in this series, if we want to be Jesus followers, if we want to truly follow Jesus, we have to understand the way of Jesus and then seek to live in his footsteps. So the first observation we make about this text is Zacchaeus was a spiritual outsider, but he was curious. He was a spiritual outsider, but he was curious. Luke gives us plenty of reasons why Zacchaeus didn't belong. Primarily because he was a chief tax collector, which means that he was a Jewish man, but he had sold out to work for Rome as one who would exploit his own people. That Rome would come into a place, and when they took control, they would set people up and kind of set up a puppet government, but they would get people to be tax collectors to charge. And here's the deal. They could charge whatever they wanted for taxes, right? There would be a set price that Rome would say, each person owes us this amount. But they didn't dictate how much tax collectors could bring in. So if Rome, for instance, said, hey, taxes are like $5, a tax collector could come along and say, hey, your taxes are $10. And they give $5 to Rome and pocket the other 5. Consequently, they were extremely wealthy. And the fact that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector probably meant that he had other tax collectors working under him. He was the head honcho in this area of tax collectors, which means he was wealthy, but he did it through dishonest means. And it also meant that he was socially isolated and spiritually dismissed. In the eyes of the crowd that day, he was disqualified, well, not just different. And yet, something really crazy happens. What we learn very early on in this account is that Zacchaeus was seeking to see who Jesus was. Although he was spiritually an outsider at that time, he was curious about Jesus. It doesn't say he was hostile towards Jesus. It doesn't say that he wanted to get a better spot so he could mock Jesus. He wasn't trying to trap Jesus with questions, much unlike many of the religious leaders that day were. He was just curious about this Jesus. He wanted to see him. He wanted to know what he was all about. He wanted to see if he really was who the people said he was. Something was stirring in Zacchaeus' heart. Even though he was spiritually outside, he was curious about who Jesus was. And really that reminds me of a lot of where our world is at today. You realize we live in a time and a place in the history of the world right now where there's really a heightened spiritual curiosity. Much like Zacchaeus, there are many Zacchaeuses out in our world today, out in Gresham today, in your workplaces, in your families, in the people you know who you've thought, well, they just don't do the Jesus thing, they don't do the church thing. There are Zacchaeuses out there who are kind of curious about this Jesus thing. And they want to see him. They want to get a glimpse of him. They're interested in what he is all about. People are asking questions again like, is there more to life than just what we see right now? Is there hope beyond what we see and can and taste? Who is this Jesus guy really? Those are the questions honestly being asked by so many in our world today, like Zacchaeus. People just trying to get a glimpse of Jesus to see if he's worth following or not. To see if the stories that people have told about this guy Jesus are real or not. But Luke tells us Zacchaeus had a problem. Not just that he was a wee little man. Or a wee little man was he. But on account of the crowds, he could not see Jesus. The crowd that day blocked his view. Remember the crowd dynamic. They're pushing in. They're wanting to see Jesus. They're wanting to get a glimpse of Jesus. And they blocked his view, not necessarily because they were intentionally cruel. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But because in their pursuit of seeing Jesus, they were shielding somebody else who wanted to see Jesus. Because they were focused on themselves, pressing in, getting closer, making sure they could see. So Zacchaeus does something desperate. He climbs this tree, this sycamore tree, we're told. Because he wants to get a glimpse. This would have been a pretty undignified move from somebody of his kind of social stature, right? He was wealthy. He was known around town as wealthy. He was probably in that crowd wearing some of the nicest clothes of anybody. And yet his curiosity drove him up a tree to get a glimpse of Jesus. He wanted to see. As I was sitting with this truth, I was sitting with the reality that even today, I think some of the greatest barriers people have to seeing Jesus isn't even their sin, although that is a barrier, but sometimes it's the crowd around Jesus that becomes the barrier for people to see Jesus. Without even meaning to, Christians sometimes make it hard for people to see who Jesus really is. Because often we speak louder about what we're against than what we're for. Sometimes we get caught in the trap where we expect people to behave like believers before they belong to Jesus. Sometimes, even unintentionally, we use insider language, or we assume everyone knows how to act and do that thing. And so people just feel like they're crowded out, like they can't really see Jesus. Maybe it's just that sometimes, even without meaning to, we project judgment rather than just the love of Jesus. And again, I'm not throwing rocks. I'm not saying that we're doing this on purpose. Much like I don't believe that crowd that day was purposely like trying to keep somebody from seeing Jesus, but just as we do life, sometimes we just get moving in the flow of things, and we're not intentional about seeing the Zacchaeuses of our worlds. And so because Zacchaeus was there, he couldn't see Jesus, and sometimes people who are curious can't see Jesus either. That's why we talk here often at River Hills that our vision of our church is just to lift Jesus higher than anything else, right? Because we want to lift him up so that people can see him clearly, right? We don't want to let ourselves be the guardians of getting in the way of people seeing and beholding Jesus, because we really, really believe this, that when people see Jesus for who he is, we don't have to do any work to make him look more cool or awesome than he already is. He's the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. He's the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He doesn't need any of our help to look cool. He needs us to step out of the way so that lost people can see him. So, the question isn't, are there outsiders out there? The question is, are we making space for them to see Jesus? Because really the truth is, friends, we don't need to be perfect people. We don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to stand guard protecting Jesus. We need to allow people access to him. People like Zacchaeus who are curious about him. But the great news of this story is even when the crowd blocked the view, Jesus didn't miss seeing Zacchaeus. Jesus never misses seeing the people he wants to see. I love this. Jesus stops and notices. This is where the point turns, the story turns. Luke says it this way. He says, and when Jesus came to the place, he looked up. I love that phrase. In fact, this is one of those things that I hadn't seen until this week when I was reading it. He came to the place. What place is that? The place where he was intent to see Zacchaeus. You see, so many times we believe, and it's true, that Zacchaeus, the point of the story was Zacchaeus. Look at Zacchaeus. He was intent to see Jesus. But did we consider the fact that Jesus was intent to see Zacchaeus? His intention that day was to see Zacchaeus. He stops. The crowd pressing in with important people vying for his attention, with the momentum and the urgency and the expectations all around, Jesus stops and he looks up. In that culture, in that time, Zacchaeus was just unnoticed by everybody else, except for Jesus. It's the way of Jesus. He stops and he notices people who are sometimes on the outside. He stops and he notices. It's what Jesus did all throughout the Gospels. When he was walking through a crowd of people, you may remember the story, and a woman touched his garment, and he stops because he wanted to see her. He noticed the blind men crying out in the streets that no one else noticed, that everyone walked past. He stops and notices. In a crowd of people where there's children running all over the place, and the disciples are like, get these kids out of here. Jesus has important things to do. Jesus stops and he says, no, let those kids come to me. Jesus stops and notices the people who society had put on the outside. And that matters because I think a lot of people don't feel unseen, they feel unnoticed. Like we're surrounded by people all the time, yet sometimes feel invisible. Sometimes we show up and we feel overlooked. Sometimes we're close enough to hear about Jesus, but not sure anyone really cares. And Zacchaeus, notice this, he wasn't calling out from the tree. That wasn't his intention for the day. He just wanted to see Jesus. He wasn't calling out. He wasn't demanding attention. He was just trying to get a glimpse, and Jesus notices him anyway. And then he does something even more crazy. He looks up in that tree, stops, he comes to the place where he was appointed that day to meet up with Zacchaeus. And then he says, hey, Zacchaeus. I think it's pretty quiet in the crowd at this point, right? Because the crowd was unaware that Zacchaeus was even there. Maybe they didn't even know his name because they just knew Zacchaeus as the traitor. They just knew Zacchaeus by his titles. They just knew Zacchaeus by his sins. They just knew Zacchaeus as the dirtbag who came around and charged them too much money. He was the corrupt IRS agent that everybody in town hated. That's what they knew Zacchaeus by. They maybe didn't even know his name. They knew his reputation, but Jesus, although he was not unfamiliar with Zacchaeus' sin, he still knew his name. And so he calls him by his name, Zacchaeus. And I think something starting to stir in the soul of Zacchaeus at this moment. He says, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. Remember, in a crowd of people where everyone else was trying to vie for Jesus to come to dinner at their house. People who probably had already cleaned their home because they were expecting, the religious leaders of the day, they're like, no, I'm the best in the town, so obviously Jesus is going to come have dinner with me. And Jesus stops and says, hey, Zacchaeus, I must eat at your house today. I must come. He doesn't just notice Zacchaeus, he prioritized him. He didn't say, I'll talk to you later. Let me get, some of my obligations done and then we'll get around to it. He doesn't say, get your life together first and then I'll come. Jesus met Zacchaeus right where he was. There's a book that shaped a lot of my thinking, especially right around when I was in Bible college, and then I've used it to teach when I've taught at Bible college. And it's a book by a pastor in Colorado named Aaron Chambers, and he writes a book called Eats with Sinners. And it just shows throughout, actually he goes through the whole Gospel of Luke and just shows Jesus around tables of sinners and how he interacts with people. And one of the things I love that he says is that Jesus didn't change lives by keeping a distance. He changed lives through relational presence, through stopping, sharing space, and entering into people's everyday lives. And sometimes we, I think, get so much in a hurry that we just fail to see people, right? Like, if we're in the crowd that day, like, we're just moving along with it, right? And I know how that goes because that's what I do all the time. We're just moving to the next thing, moving to the next thing, moving to the next thing, moving to the next thing. And in order to actually see people the way Jesus sees people, and a way to do that is to recognize, to be praying daily that we would see people the way Jesus sees people, that we would see the lost the way Jesus sees the lost, to be praying and then going at a pace that allows the way of Jesus to come out in our lives. Sometimes we just get so busy that I just run past every opportunity because I'm not walking the pace of the way of Jesus. But Jesus stops. When everybody else would have pressed on, Jesus stops. and notices those who are on the outside, because Jesus wants outsiders to come in. Why did Jesus do that? Because Jesus didn't want there to be outsiders and insiders. The heart of Jesus is that these are God's children. He wants all of them to be insiders. He doesn't want there to be groups of people outside and inside. He wants all people to come to know God through a relationship with Jesus Christ, through himself. And so that was not on the agenda for the crowd that day. We know this because this is how the crowd reacts. And when they saw it, they grumbled. They started murmuring, right? They started grumbling. Why is this guy talking to Zacchaeus? Doesn't he know who he is? This stirred up frustration within the insiders. Not because they didn't know Zacchaeus was a sinner, but because that's all they knew about Zacchaeus. All they could see was what they could see on the outside. They didn't pause to consider that God was stirring something on the inside, that God was at work and doing something ahead of him. To them, Zacchaeus was a category. He was a tax collector, a sinner, a traitor. To Jesus, Zacchaeus was a man with a name. He was a child of God who had lost his way, and God wanted him back in his family. And this is where Jesus constantly ruffled feathers. Like you read it, right? Like going back a few weeks ago when we talked about Luke, like I told you that this was going to be the tension piece, right? This was going to be the tension piece in all of the Gospel of Luke, is where Jesus is like, does things like this. And for the crowd that day, this was their tension. They started grumbling. They're like, why is he eating with him? Do they not know who he is? The religious elites wanted to set clear boundaries, and Jesus just wanted to restore people. So he saw and he looked. And the reality is, if we want to walk the way of Jesus, it's going to take some stopping and intentionally noticing people who are on the outside, but it's also going to be having a heart to say, that person God wants to be on the inside. God has a heart for this person. It's a heart posture that allows others in. So the question, I guess, is, are we guarding the circle or are we widening the table? Because the way of Jesus has always been to welcome. That's the word that kind of goes along with the series. Remember last week we talked about the word being go. This week it's welcome. That was the heart posture of Jesus, the way of Jesus. Go and welcome. Because when that happens, you can write this in, the grace of Jesus produces real change in real lives. What next happens in this story would have shocked anyone who was reading it and should shock us. Luke tells us that Zacchaeus stands up, which means they had been spending the afternoon together. This is kind of where we get this story. So he comes down from the tree, he goes and has a meal with Zacchaeus. Here's where I wish I could be in that room, because I would love to know what happens in that room that day. Because we just get this scene, it's kind of disjointed. Luke the story just kind of breaks to the main point, but I want to know the interactions, right? What was it about an afternoon with Jesus allows Zacchaeus' heart to move in this way? Because all we get to see is this. Behold, Zacchaeus saying, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. This isn't some small gesture. This is life-altering cost to Zacchaeus. And I just want to know what happens in the afternoon with Jesus that brings Zacchaeus to this spot where Zacchaeus isn't offering his leftovers. He's not giving Jesus this religious tip. He's essentially dismantling the very means by which he became wealthy. He undoes it all. This would have completely undone his entire lifestyle, his status, and his future security. And we have to ask, why would he do this? Jesus, as far as we know, didn't demand it. Jesus didn't threaten him or negotiate terms with him. What was it about Jesus in the afternoon that Zacchaeus spent with Jesus that brought Zacchaeus to this heart space? I would propose that it's the grace of Jesus. That Jesus' grace, when we fully understand the impact of the grace of Jesus, it changes real lives. It has to. It has to change our life, and it has to change the lives of those around us, or else we don't understand the grace of Jesus fully. Like, I don't know if there's any way we could fully understand, but Paul, the Apostle Paul, I think he came about as close as a human being could come to understanding the grace of God, because he said things like, it's by God's grace that I am what I am, and his grace upon me was not without effect. Because of the grace of God, I went harder than anyone else, and what allowed Paul to do all that he did for the cause of the gospel was he understood at the core level of who he was about the grace of God. And I think Zacchaeus did too. That there was something in the way that Jesus spoke, in the eyes of Jesus in the afternoon he spent, where Zacchaeus began to understand the grace. And an encounter with Jesus does something that rules and pressure can never do. It reshaped his heart. Zacchaeus didn't give that up to be saved, but because salvation had begun to take root in his heart, it was the obvious reaction. Grace did this. Religion often says, change and then you'll be accepted. Jesus says, you're accepted. Now watch how your life will change. Jesus confirms it. He says it this way: today, salvation has come to this house. And just to throw this in too, he says, for this man is a child of Abraham. You realize for Zacchaeus, he stopped being considered a son of Abraham when he sold himself out to be a tax collector. Everyone in all of that society said, you've given up your birthright as a son of Abraham. They would have told him that. He would have been kept out of the temple worship. He would have been kept out of any synagogues. He was socially outside of all of it. And Jesus, to the awe and shock of anyone in that house that day, said, salvation's come to this house. Zacchaeus, you're a son of Abraham now. What was once lost is now found. What was once blind now sees. Salvation has come to the house, not someday, not after a probationary period, not after he gets everything in his life cleaned up, but today. Salvation didn't arrive when Zacchaeus climbed a tree. It didn't arrive when he made the speech. It arrived when Zacchaeus went all in with Jesus. When he said, when he opened up his home, his heart, and his future to Jesus. That's the afternoon. Everything changed for Zacchaeus, and it's still happening today. Again, friends, there are Zacchaeuses all over around us. In fact, some of you today in this room might be Zacchaeus. And you're curious about Jesus, this guy Jesus. And maybe today, this was just your climbing of the sycamore tree because you wanted to get a glimpse. You wanted to get a glimpse of this Jesus to see if he's really what people say he is. And what I want you to see in this story, if that's you, is that the grace of Jesus can change your life because it always has. It changes real lives and real stories. And God's grace is available for you today, right now. not because of anything you can do, not because you're good, but because he's good. And because he says you're loved. Because he says that I can forgive that past that you don't think is forgivable. So what do we have to do? Like Zacchaeus, salvation comes when we go all in with Jesus. Salvation comes when we when we open up the doors of our home, of our heart, and our future to Jesus. And the amazing thing is grace doesn't just forgive our past, it reorientates our future. Grace doesn't just loosen the grip on things, it allows us to trust. And grace is something we can build our life on. Man, that's what happens when salvation meets surrender. We see it in the story of Zacchaeus, and it's still happening today. For those of you who have already done that, made Jesus the Lord of your life, I need us to start believing again that people all around us are Zacchaeuses who are curious, and that part of living the way of Jesus is to stop and to notice and to pour in and to be part of the introductory process of people to the grace of Jesus. Because when we do that, we begin living the Jesus way. The way of Jesus is clear. The way of Jesus is crystal clear in this passage and all over through the Gospel of Luke. He says it this way in verse 10. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. It's the way of Jesus. And if it's the way of Jesus, it has to become our way as well. Again, back to that book, Eats with Sinners. I love it because it reminded me that evangelism is rarely an event and most often an intentional relationship lived out around tables or over coffee, in conversations at playgrounds or at the workplace, by noticing people that no one else notices. That's where evangelism happens. That's where the way of Jesus happens. So the question I want us to consider today, that I want us to, each one of us to challenge ourselves with is, am I living the way of Jesus, or am I just watching from the sidelines? It can be pretty easy to just get on that crowd side of things where we're just intent upon seeing Jesus for ourselves and never noticing the Zacchaeuses of the world. Friends, the way of Jesus is to notice the Zacchaeuses of the world. I want to conclude with a story that captures kind of the way of Jesus from a little bit different angle. This story was from quite a few years ago, but man, it struck me this week. In Japan, there was a cliff, a series of cliffs called the Tojimbo Cliffs, and it's where literally hundreds of people a year would go to end their life. It was a very popular tourist donation, but it was also a place where people came and just with no hope and would jump to their death. And there was one Japanese detective named Yukio Shigai. And for years, he was responsible for going and investigating these deaths. And he would go and he'd have to clean up the remains. He'd have to inform families. He would, like, it was like, many, many times a year he'd have to go do this. Well, when he retired, he determined that he didn't want to see that. He was going to do something about it. And so in his retirement, he decided that he bought a little place right up there by the cliffs. And every day, 2-3 times a day, he'd go patrol the cliffs. And he'd walk and he'd look for people who didn't have a camera out because they weren't there to take pictures. People with a hopeless look in their eye. And he would go up to them And he'd just ask, how are you doing today? And at that, many people would just break down crying. If not, then he'd get in a conversation with them. At some point, he'd look to just try to put an arm on their shoulder or something. And if they would let him, he would talk them off the cliff by just being there. He'd invite them back to his house where he would make them the traditional meal of New Year in Japan. Rice cakes and things that would be very familiar to them. And he'd talk to them about hope. And it said that this one man, and it started to grow, he started getting more volunteers who would go out there with him. But when the Time magazine article ran on him, it had said that he had saved single-handedly over 180 lives in his time of just going. And what allowed him to do that? He was not a great orator. He didn't give great speeches or great lectures. What allowed him to do that is that he just noticed lost people. People who had lost hope. And he, unlike everyone else there, maybe who was snapping pictures or he just saw and he went and approached because he stopped and he noticed. It's what Jesus did with the guys like Zacchaeus and all throughout the Gospels. It's what this Japanese man did. It's just noticing people that everyone else either doesn't notice or judges from afar. Because when we stop and notice lost people and our heartbeat is for outsiders to become in, it's amazing what God does. Because it's not about us. It's not our grace that we're offering. It's about inviting people to understand and know the one who can bring real change and real hope. Sometimes I think people just need to hear, hey, I see you. You're known and you're loved. That's the way of Jesus. It's got to be our way too. Let's pray. God, thank you for your grace. Your amazing grace that changed our lives. God, I pray that if there are people in this room today that haven't gone all in with you, that maybe today they would hear your offer of salvation and like Zacchaeus, go all in with you. God, I pray for those in this room who have gone all in with you, and I ask that you would give us your eyes. That we would, like Paul, be so driven by grace, by the amazing grace that you've given us, that we would also begin to notice and see the lost around us. God, make your way our way. And would we get off the sidelines and see people the way you see them. In Jesus' name, amen.